Good evening, everyone. So I'm Nikki Giannis, a member of the Teen Council at the DC Public Library. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's conversation and the launch of the Avengers Assembled by David Betancourt. As you saw in the video, the Teen Council is a DC Public Library's paid leadership opportunity for teens. I'm one of the 12 members from across the district that work in neighborhood libraries across each ward. The DC Public Library Foundation is a supporter of the Teen Council and tonight's event. The first 50 registered attendees tonight received a free copy of the Avengers Assembled, courtesy of the DC Public Library Foundation. I'm excited to open tonight's program and congratulate not only a friend of the library, but a fellow DC native on this wonderful accomplishment. David is a comic book culture reporter. David is a comic book culture reporter at the Washington Post, a role he created around his love of comic books. He also serves as a lecturer at the University of Maryland Philip Merrill College of Journalism, where he teaches the comic book and culture and reporting class. This year, David also contributed to the Edge of the Spider-Verse series, which launched over the summer. Leading tonight's conversation is Helena Andrews Dyer. Helena is a senior culture writer at the Washington Post. She is the author of Reclaiming of the Time, B is the New Black, and The Mamas. Her work has appeared in the Oprah magazine, Glamour magazine, and the New York Times. So, please welcome David and Helena.
Yes. Awesome. So everyone can hear me, yes? Okay, welcome. I learned this from Glory Adam, who does Well-Read Black Girl here at the library. I want you to just take a moment. Breathe, take this all in. This is your pub week. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So we're going to start off. David, can you hear David?
Can you guys hear me? Okay, great.
Yeah? Okay. So we're going to have a little 30-minute conversation, but I want to leave as much room as possible for you all to ask questions. And we are going to talk about your career. We're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about comics. So I want to start off with something that should be easy for you. When did you first fall in love with comics?
Well, first I'd like to say this is a very cool setup because Helena and I sit next to each other at work. So it just feels like we're at work with people watching us now.
Yes,
Pretty cool.
but we're going to have a PG conversation.
Yes.
A G-rated conversation.
This combo will be for everyone, kids' ears, all that stuff. When did I fall in love with comics? Comics have been a part of my life since I was very young. My initial attraction to superheroes started with my parents. My father was an avid comic book reader, and my mother was a big fan of the old Adam West Batman show. So literally my earliest memories with my mom, 3-4 years old, were watching that old Adam West Batman series, which I didn't find out until I was about 40 years old was a comedy. Like that, like when I was a little kid, that was serious drama for me. Like, oh man, Robin's hanging from a fence. What's that?
Blam!
Yeah,
Zoom!
all the onomatopoeia, all that stuff. But my first foray into comic books, my cousin Louis was just here, who works at Amtrak. He surprised me. He's actually the person that got my dad into reading Marvel comics. They both shared their collections with me as a kid. But my grandparents, Eligio and Anna Betancourt, who are no longer with us, they lived in Suitland, Maryland, not too far from here, a straight shot from Andrews Air Force Base. So if you would leave Andrews Air Force Base in PG in Suitland, you could go straight to the 7-Eleven, and they always had a spinner rack of comics there. I wish 7-Eleven still had comic books, but when I was a kid, you can go into a 7-Eleven, get a Slurpee, and get a comic book for $1. So it was this combination of that spinner rack and, seeing all these cool characters, Spider-Man, X-Men, Batman. Also, comics were only $1 back then, so if I could find $1 laying around and, scrounge up some change for tax, I knew that I could get a comic book and get lost in those worlds. I'd say the first comic that really just grabbed a hold of me and, that's when I realized I was really into the genre was, I'd say I was about 8 years old. It was a story called A Death in the Family, illustrated by one of my favorite artists, Jim Aparo. This was the moment when DC Comics decided to kill Robin the Boy Wonder. I was a big Robin fan. Robin's actually, don't tell Marvel, one of my favorite characters. And when that moment happened, when they decided to kill Robin, it was just like this wormhole into learning the history of the Robins. Dick Grayson was grown up and had become Nightwing. Jason Todd, I was like, who is this Jason guy? He was the one that was killed by the Joker that opened the door for Tim Drake to become Robin. He ended up being one of my favorite characters ever. So that particular moment in the late 80s, being a kid, was really kind of my path into it. It also helped having young parents. My parents were 16 when I was born. My father always joked that we grew up together. I would spend time with him in his dorm while he was studying in College Park, and he would just leave me in his dorm room and I'd read his comics. So I had very young parents. That's why I was sitting around watching Batman with my mom. She was like 21 at the time. So it was, very, we kind of enjoyed it all together, and that's really was my bridge to these worlds.
I love the idea that the core memory, like the core memory that you remembered the exact comic. That
I
sort of
remember
like
exactly where it was.
sucked you in and what the story was.
And trying to explain it to my mother, because I said, Mom, you don't understand. Robin is dead. The Joker killed him. So because it was like a rumor in the playground, like, yo, the Joker killed Robin. So I had these images of like Cesar Romero, like pummeling Burt Ward, like, like, what's going on? And that's not how it looked in the book, but those were the images that went into my head. So I remember trying to explain it to my mother, and she's like, that's nice, Dave. And it was, but yeah, that was it.
And I like this idea also of being a little kid, because comics, being a young person, loving, first of all, comics, everyone, the fans from these little ones I see in the audience to grown men I see, and then women in the audience. But like as a young person, do comics and graphic storytelling, does that lend itself to being able to understand the story better, like pulling you also into literacy and a love of books and a love of storytelling?
Absolutely. First of all, the first initial draw to comics for me was the art. When I was really, really young, 4 or 5, I didn't care too much about the words. I just wanted to be able to draw the images that I saw. Like my parents would tell you, if I had a pen and a pad, I was just spending all day drawing Batman and Spider-Man, trying to memorize the line movement and all that stuff. I obviously ended up becoming a writer, not an artist, so I didn't draw that well. But I remember it was very... I'm sorry, I lost track. What was the question?
Talking about drawing you into story.
Yes. No. In terms of literacy, comics were everything for me. One day, my teacher called my parents and said, David is reading at a grade level higher than everybody, so we have to put him in a separate group of readers when we're working on reading. And my parents were like, well, we're certainly not doing anything.
Those $1 comics from 7-Eleven.
But no, and I remember talking with Valerie Strauss about this, our education reporter at the Post. If a child has found a way into reading, it doesn't matter what it is. Because my mom used to be she didn't like comics. She wanted me to read real books and stuff like that. But obviously, after this, she's changed her mind a little bit. But comics were, they were my path to reading well. I remember when I was in 7th grade, somebody said to me, does anyone know what a red herring is? And I said, yeah, that's a clue that's designed to lead you on the wrong path. And she said, how the hell do you know that? And I said, because I read an X-Men comic written by Chris Claremont and drawn by Jim Lee, and there was a specific panel where Cyclops said, this is a red herring. And I just remember.
I love that.
So,
Any elementary school teachers in the audience, you want to get your kids into reading, let them read comics.
Yeah.
I love that. And this brings us to a particular comic book character and comic that you like. I'm going to read this quote. To celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Spider-Man movie, the first Spider-Man movie, because there have been many, you wrote about your connection to the film, and you wrote, when you saw the first film, when you were in college, I walked out not only convinced that I'd seen one of the greatest contributions to comic book culture, but also with a determination to somehow one day be a part of it. You were a journalist. You thought you would be a sports journalist. That movie changed your path, and now you covered comic book culture for the Washington Post. Tell us about that journey. This is going to be a long answer, but tell us about that journey from walking out of the first Spider-Man movie, wanting to be a part of it, and sitting here now.
So I remember exactly where I was when I saw Spider-Man for the first time. Also in that column, I do remember also saying I had every intention of being a sports reporter. I grew up reading the sports page here. Obviously, Washington, previously, when I was younger, had a rich history in sports. But in that column, I said Tony Kornheiser and Michael Wilbon. Those were my Avengers when I was in college. PTI started when I was a junior at Radford. They were my rock stars. They were my everything. And when I got to the Post in 2004, I wanted to go on the path of being them. But when I saw Spider-Man, which ironically I wasn't supposed to see. So it's like the day before I'm set to graduate and become the first Betancourt to graduate from college.
Say that again. Say that again.
The first Betancourt to graduate from
Okay.
college, which wasn't for good intentions. My grandfather was a football legend at Mount Vernon. He came here from Puerto Rico when he was 8 years old, got a scholarship to NC State. The South wasn't too great to olive-colored guys in the 50s, so he's, kind of said, I'm going to go back to Northern Virginia. My dad was at Maryland for 3 years, but when my sister Ashley was born, he had to drop out. So we almost got there, but I was the first one to get there. So it's the day before I'm about to graduate from Radford. I get a call from my roommate, Wade Todd, freshman year. He's like, Dave, actually, you know what? It was an AIM message. Anybody remember AIM?
AIM.
Like we
what
didn't
does
have
that even stand for? What did AIM stand
AOL
for?
Instant Messenger.
Oh, I should know this. I'm
Sorry
the
for showing
IM
my
of the
age here, but
generation.
we didn't have cell phones to text each other back
No.
then. Yeah. It also yes is a Marvel acronym as well. But I get a call from my roommate and he says, Dave, this is in Radford, Virginia, about 20 minutes from Virginia Tech, back when Michael Vick was tearing it up on the football field. That was the exact same time. He says, Dave, I've got a friend that works at the Radford movie theater. They've got the Spider-Man reel. He has to test out the reel, and he's invited me to come, says I can bring whoever. My roommate knew the only thing I loved more than sports was comics. So I see this movie. I see the first Spider-Man movie. I'm blown away by what Sam Raimi's done in terms of bringing in his love of the 60s Spider-Man comics. Tobey Maguire's performance as Peter was fantastic. Danny Elfman, who scored my favorite movie of all time, the 1989 Batman movie, did the score, and it just blew me away. And I walked out of that movie, as I said in the column, I was changed. And it was weird because the time wasn't right yet. Comics hadn't taken over Hollywood yet, but I just knew in my bones that I wanted to someday be able to tell a story like that.
Wow. And so then you started the Washington Post.
I go to the Washington Post. I got to the Post in 2004 in the sports department, where I was an agate clerk alongside Tom LeGros and Dan Steinberg, who are big stars at the Post now. We were, agate guys back then. We were all young, in our 20s. Only lasted in sports about a year. Then I went on to work with Athelia Knight, legendary sports reporter. She had the Young Journalist Development Program. I was her assistant. But then I left for a little bit because, I started off as a news aide at the Post, and that's not the most lucrative career choice coming out of college. I went and did government contracting for 3 years, but eventually was asked to come back as an editor for our Wire news service. So I came back in 2012, and when I came back in 2012, Michael Kavanaugh had his Comic Riffs blog that he had just started. Michael's a dear friend and a huge supporter of my work. And Michael was, former syndicated cartoonist, concentrating on comic strips and political cartoons. He knew the superhero thing was getting big, but he didn't have time to cover it. So here I am, this snot-nosed kid, and I say, hey, would you mind if I write about superhero stuff for you for your blog? And he kindly, and to something that had a huge impact on my career, said yes. So when the Avengers movie came out, the first Avengers movie, 2012, $200 million opening weekend, just bonkers. That was the big bang moment of when...
Now the dam has burst open.
Yeah, everything that the movie critics are complaining about now, that was like the genesis, that movie. So I walked into Kevin Merida's office. Kevin at the time was the #2 guy at the Post, right underneath Marty Baron. And I said, look, man, superheroes are about to take over Hollywood. I'm like, we have the Comic Riffs blog already. I would like to cover it for the Comic Riffs blog. I'm like, it's a language I speak. It's something that, I had all kinds of examples, because anytime, when you read a Post article, it always says the 5 most read. Anytime I wrote about comics, it always got in the most read. I had screenshots. I was just flipping my phone to Kevin, look at all these times people are reading my stories. But long story short, Kevin believed in me, and one of the last things he did before he went to ESPN, Kevin is now the executive editor at the Los Angeles Times. He put me in the style section and gave me the path to becoming who I am now.
And now you cover comic book culture. One of the few people, I would say, in the country at a major news organization covering comic book culture.
It's me and Michael, that's it. There are other people who cover, there's my good friend George Costanez at the New York Times. He writes about comic book culture a lot. The LA Times used to have a blog called Hero Complex by Jeff Boucher, but then Jeff left. But Michael and I are the only two reporters in the country that are dedicated to covering this culture full time. That's something we're very proud of.
This billion-dollar industry. Yes.
Just a small little thing. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get to Avengers Assembled, but first I want to talk about the fact that this is not your first byline in the comic book world. I believe, was it 21 when you wrote your first Miles Morales comic? Do we all know who Miles Morales is?
Anyone ever heard of Miles? Yeah.
So I want to, and 3 years before you wrote in the post, so I went deep into your crates, David. You said, Miles Morales and I will always be linked. And that was after, I believe, the first movie.
Yes.
Was that around after the first movie, the
Spider-Verse.
Spider-Verse. Talk to us about Miles Morales, that character, and why you feel so connected to him, and then the process of actually writing a story for Miles Morales.
So Miles means a lot to me because he is the first superhero that I truly saw myself in. Miles has one Puerto Rican parent and one African-American parent. My father is Puerto Rican. My grandparents came from Puerto Rico, both when they were young. My grandfather got here in Mount Vernon when he was 8. My grandmother got to Brooklyn when she was 16, not speaking a lick of English. And they both turned themselves into, that, strong-knit Americana family. And my mother's family is African-American. My great-grandparents integrated Mount Pleasant. They got there when it wasn't it wasn't the black neighborhood that it had become over the 70s, 80s, and 90s before gentrification kind of reset the dial.
And you were still rooted in Mount Pleasant.
Yes. Yeah. I'm thank you, Mama and Granddaddy, because the real estate decisions they made 20 years before I was born have done wonders for future generations of Betancourt, let me tell you. So
Miles as a character.
Miles means a lot to me because, comics historically, you're dealing with characters like Superman and Batman. These are characters that were created in the 20s and 30s. Batman and Superman have been around for 8 decades. They're veering towards the century mark. But comics have always been a primarily white world. And a lot of that has to do with when they came to be. Something that was created in the 20s and 30s is clearly going to reflect what society allowed to be put into those particular genres and who was at the table. So when Miles came on the scene, I'll never forget, I got first there was the USA Today, so USA Today broke it, and then Michael Kavner reached out to me. I wasn't even working at the Post, I was doing my government contracting at the time. I was at Walter Reed in Bethesda, and just wondering what the hell I'd done with my life to be at Walter Reed in Bethesda when I knew I wanted to be a writer. But Michael Kavner called me, and he said, have you seen the Spider-Man news? I said, I'll rephrase it. I said, you're gosh darn right. I saw this. I didn't say gosh darn, but I said, yeah, I saw it. He said, look, man, there are only 2 people. Michael said this to me, and it meant a lot to me. He said, there are only 2 people in the world I want to hear about this from, Stan Lee and you.
Wow.
And, and I still, my cousin had just left. I still remember, because Michael actually, when I wrote something about it, he led the column with some words, and he said, these are the 2 people I wanted to talk to, Stan Lee and Miles. And my cousin Louis said, why the hell are you so important that your name's next to Stan Lee? What are you doing? But the point is, Brian Michael Bendis, who co-created Miles Morales with Sarah Pichelli, there was this great comic book called Ultimate Spider-Man, and it was around from 2000 to 2010. To me, it's some of the best Spider-Man stuff ever written by Brian Michael. Yes, you should clap. It's still my favorite Spider-Man comics to this day. It was written by Brian Michael Bendis and drawn by Mark Bagley, one of the greatest Spider-Man artists ever. It was an alternate universe in the Marvel Comics world, so they were able to create a new Spider-Man, make him a teenager, bring him into the modern world, and they killed that Peter Parker. And actually wrote a column saying how angry I was that they killed him. And they had a picture of Miles, and he was in his suit, and they're like, but you didn't know who was underneath the mask.
Okay.
And I remember seeing, this. I'm like, damn, this suit is really fantastic. I'm like, but I know it's just going to be some blonde-haired kid under here. Because I was like, how are they going to...
You didn't believe it.
Well, I was like, how are they going to make him look different from Peter Parker? I'm like, you can't have a carbon copy. People aren't going to get hyped up for that. And I said, what is so special? I said, what is so damn special about this kid that they literally killed off one of their greatest creations of the last few decades? And when the news broke that it was Miles and the alliteration in the name, and the background, it hit me really hard.
Yeah.
Because I thought the only way I'd see a character like that was if I created him myself. And for Brian and Sarah to have the foresight, because the only way a character like Miles isn't going to exist unless a white comic book creator, it's a predominantly white industry, with star power says, we're going to do this. And Brian took his star power. I liken it to Damon Lindelof and what he did with Watchmen, where, Damon said, I'm going to use my white influence in Hollywood to tell this very black story.
Yeah.
And that's very similar to what Brian did with Miles. So Miles's creation just, it hit me. I was actually the first reporter to ask Brian specifically, because the headline said, half Latino, half black Spider-Man. But, as a Latino, I can say,
What does that mean, half Latino?
Yeah, well,
where is he from?
Well, exactly. Like, if I tell my grandmother, hey, I'm dating this Latina girl, she's going to say, pero de donde es?
Yeah.
Ella boliviana, colombiana, de donde es? Like, Latinos, we always want to know what flag you're
Where
waving.
you're from,
I
yeah.
don't know if you've ever seen this thing called the World Cup, but Latinos are very passionate about where they're from. So I asked Brian, I'm like, Brian, I have to know. I'm like, it's not enough to know that this kid has a Latino parent and an African-American parent. I'm like, this is New York. Miles is in Brooklyn, so he's either Puerto Rican or Dominican. Which one is he? I was very much rooting for Puerto Rico, and when Brian said Puerto Rico, I kind of had to pause, and I said, look, Brian, we're gonna stop the chat. I'm like, and just be two guys who like comics. I said, my mother's black and my father's Puerto Rican, and Brian, he said something I'll never forget. He said, oh, you are Miles, then, and that really. To hear that from the creator, it hit me. This is years before I'd ever write anything.
Yeah.
I'd written a lot for the Post about Miles, but I hadn't written anything for Marvel yet. So after all that, I get a call from Angelique Roche. Angelique Roche is a very prominent host of many different Marvel events. She's very influential in the Marvel stratosphere for the comic book branch. And it turns out Angelique is best friends with Soraya McDonald's older sister. Soraya McDonald is a former Post colleague of mine who now writes for ESPN, Pulitzer nominated, extremely talented. And Angelique said, Marvel's looking for, they started this thing called Voices. And what Voices was at Marvel was comics written and illustrated by people of color.
Okay.
So they had Black voices, they had Latino voices, they've had Asian voices, they've had LGBTQ voices, they've done it all. So Angelique was looking for someone to contribute. I wrote an essay about Miles and what he meant to me as a character and how much it inspired me and helped me have faith in the comic book industry. And the folks at Marvel really liked it to the point where a year later they said, hey, well, we're doing a Latino voices anthology, and we'd like you to write one of the characters. And I said, if it's Miles, I'm there. And they gave me Miles, and I told my first story in Marvel Voices Comunidades, which was a Latino anthology from Marvel. That made me, Miles has had African-American writers before, such as Jason Reynolds, but there's never been anyone, a Puerto Rican, or specifically someone like Miles, who's Puerto Rican and African-American, who's written him. So if anyone ever asks you who was the first Puerto Rican and African-American person to write Miles Morales, right here.
This guy. Yeah. Before we move on to Avengers, just quickly, for the folks in the audience, because I see so many young faces who want to write comic books, quickly advice to them on where to start, what to do now.
If you're young and want to write comic books one day, the best thing you can do is keep reading them. That's it's literally like, you see those videos for, oh, this is my master class. You know what the master class is? Reading comic books. It's a great way to, one, figure out what you like, and also there's no better teacher. There are courses on it. You can buy books. Brian, who I just mentioned, has a book on how to write comics. but there's no better teacher than just diving into the source material.
Reading. Okay. All right. That's a good one, and I'm sure everyone is going to be doing that. So now we're going to move on to Avengers Assembled. So the book just came out. Some of you are holding it in your hands.
That's wild to see, by the way.
And when you open it up, you'll see that this book is so deeply researched. Now, as you see, David is someone who can keep a lot of factoids in his head at once, right? Like, you are someone, I think, who just, it's like a supercomputer. You're like, oh, and then I met this person is the head of this, and da-da-da-da. You have that sort of mentality. And reading this, I was just like, how do you know all of these facts? What did you have to do just to know? Because this is something someone would read who's the casual Avengers fan like myself, or someone who's literally about to write a dissertation about Tony Stark, to learn every single thing about Tony Stark. How did you get there? How many comic books did you have to read to write this book?
A lot. The first thing we had to do, so Michael Siglin had reached out to me. He's the head of Lucasfilm Publishing. I had written a story that our colleague Stephanie Mary edited, Book World, about, there's this new Star Wars book initiative called Star Wars, The High Republic. It's about Star Wars, but it's 200 years before Luke Skywalker came along. It was basically designed as a fresh jumping on point. So this was during COVID, this is 2020, wrote the story. I spent an hour on a Zoom call talking to all the authors, and Michael was on the call. And I think Michael came away from that call realizing that I wasn't just a reporter assigned to write on Star Wars. I was somebody that deeply cared about it and knew all the nuances and things like that. I take great pride when I write about this stuff that I hope the reader knows that I care about it as much as they do.
And you take it seriously.
And I take it very seriously.
Yeah.
Not to knock the Gray Lady, but for example, when I was reading their story on Tatiana Maslany, who plays She-Hulk, it was and then Tatiana left her Manhattan condo and walked across the Brooklyn Bridge and got a green smoothie. And I'm like, when are they going to talk about She-Hulk? What is going on? So my approach to this has always been, take it seriously. But so Michael reached out and said, hey, DK is, they want to write an Avengers novel, and I think they want it to be an origin story. So would you be interested in taking a meeting with us and with Marvel, or with DK and with Marvel, to see if this is something you could do? And somebody, you guys can now see how I am and how I grew up, but you get that call, and it wasn't. Oh well, I don't know, Michael. Let me think about it. I was like, yes, I would.
Leaping with joy
inside.
Yes.
I said I would absolutely like to explore this possibility. So we had a big meeting with myself, DK, who's the publisher of the book, and Marvel Entertainment in New York. DK is based in London. And I said, okay, well, if it's going to be an origin story, because there's the Avengers have been around for 60 years, and there have been so many iterations, and there have been so many different teams. That was the first thing we had to figure out. I'm like, we've only got 300 pages. That's not enough for 60 years of history. I said, if this is going to be an origin story, then we need to focus on those original comics, Avengers #1, going back to 1963. That means you're dealing with the original team. That means you're dealing with a very young Iron Man, a very out-of-control Incredible Hulk, a Thor that's still getting his way on Midgard, Giant Man and the Wasp, which had a very complicated history in the 60s that we very much have to dance around in this book. But I decided, we decided together, if this is going to be an origin story, it needs to be about the original team. So what I did, I said, okay, here's what I'll do. I'm going to read the first 100 issues.
The first 100 issues.
Yes,
okay.
of the Avengers, starting in 1963, going all the way up to 100. And let's see what we can find here. So this book is kind of a combination of the team meeting each other for the first time. You can see Loki's on the back because anyone who knows the Avengers history knows that the first time they assembled was against Loki, and the movie was actually inspired by that as well, with Tom Hiddleston in that role. So it was mainly reading 100 issues, and then I felt like a curator because I wasn't going to be able to fit 100 issues into this. That would have been impossible. I would say each chapter of this book is one issue more or less. And we actually have in the back the issues that inspire the book. But it was just a matter of reading those 100 issues and saying, okay, what are they made of? Obviously, we want to get the origins of each member. So, we've got Iron Man's origin, Cap's origin, Thor's origin, Giant Man and the Wasp, etc. And then we'll focus on the moment the team gets together and fights against Loki for the first time. And then all the trials and tribulations. So there's this thing at the end around issue 80-something of the Avengers. We're in the 70s at that point, called the Kree-Skrull War. And this is something that they're actually hinting at a little bit in the first Captain Marvel movie, and with Secret Invasion with the Skrulls and the Kree, Captain Marvel, etc. But the Kree-Skrull War was kind of like this hallmark moment in Avengers history, and it was the moment the Avengers went from being protectors of Earth to protectors of the entire universe. It's when they learned, all of them, even Thor, who was from Asgard, they realized there was a whole lot more to protect than just the Earth and its universe, but other universes as well. So I said to DK, I think we should, go from the beginning to the Kree-Skrull War. And that's what we did. There's one very fun chapter at the end because we wanted to show just a tape. 90% of this book is based off of the old comics. But there is one chapter towards the end where we jump in time to a more modern team, and that's when Sam Wilson is Captain America, and Kamala Khan's on there, and Miles Morales is on there, and Iron Man. So we've got one fun chapter towards the end where you can kind of see what the Avengers have become in the future, but the majority of the book is based on a very storied past.
And very specifically off the comics, because
Yes.
everyone, half this audience probably watched Endgame previous to our sit down, and that's a much different story. That's when I started reading it. I was like, this is not like the movies. This is very different.
There was very specific
Right?
orders from everyone, and they were very clear to me at the beginning that they did not want this, they did not want the movies to influence this. And that's kind of hard because I remember when I was writing the Iron Man chapter, I couldn't stop thinking about Robert Downey Jr. because he embodies not just the fact that he looks so much like Tony Stark, but his true-to-life personality and what he's able to do as an actor embodies that so well. But I had very strict orders that the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, should not have an influence on this, but it should just be influence from the comic books.
And I want to ask you a question about you talked about the Avengers sort of being the defenders of the Earth and then becoming the defenders of the universe. And what I thought was so interesting in reading the book, one is this trope of rebirth, right? To be a superhero is you have to be reborn from who you are before that. But there's also this idea that's you have to really love America. There is just a through line through so many of the comics and so many of the stories, even Thor's stories, he loved Earth, right? He ends up helping the Avengers who are settled in America at first, but then it's the entire planet.
And then he falls in love with the Earth.
Right, exactly. But it's just this idea of loving America so much, especially when it comes to Captain America. What do you think about that as we were talking about sort of comic books, obviously, when their iteration in the 20s and 30s and who was writing them beforehand? And moving forward, that theme of just patriotism, does it sometimes grate? Do you think okay, what America are we protecting here? What do you think about that?
That was on my mind a lot, especially when you're writing a character like Captain America. Now, obviously, when I was writing Cap, much of what I wrote, especially the chapter dedicated to his origin, was based on his time in the World Wars and being a super soldier for America. But we do, for one chapter, get a glimpse of, if anyone knows, Sam Wilson, the Falcon, in the comics, and now in the MCU, he eventually becomes Captain America. So I just gently kind of nudge that subject because I thought Marvel Comics actually handled it very well. When Marvel Comics decided in, I think it was 2016, when they decided that Sam Wilson, a black man, was going to become Captain America, it wasn't just a kumbaya story. It very much had, it was connected to the climate of the real world and how, especially here in the United States, how would we react to that? And what we get in is, you can very much see in this book that we're in two very different worlds. With Cap, we're talking about the 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever it may be. By the time we get to Sam and he becomes Captain America, I wanted to make it clear without focusing on it too much that there was resistance to Sam a black man becoming Captain America. So we get in that a little bit in there, and it's interesting because Captain America, Steve Rogers truly believes in everything America has the potential to be. We do have the potential to be the greatest place on earth. Are we doing that? I don't think so, but the potential has always been there. And
There's hope.
The hope. And that's what Steve Rogers, who's right here in the middle, always represents. He truly believes in his bones that we can be that. Sam kind of represents the more jaded side of that, and someone who, when he gets the shield and becomes Captain America, is dealing with a very different set of eyes and a very different perspective. And I think the book reflects that a little bit.
Yeah, different set of eyes. It's a great way to put it. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to ask you this final question because I know, just in having talks from you in the office, how much you loved Blue Beetle. And so I want to talk about looking forward, right, as we're talking about what superhero comics have been, what they can be, what they represent. You as the first Afro-Latino writer of a Miles Morales story. What are you most excited about? Blue Beetle tells a very specific story, a very diverse Latin family story. Miss Marvel, they're in the Marvels, it's 2 of the superheroes are women of color. Like, where do you think comic book culture, superhero movies are moving towards? What are you excited about? And tell everyone why they have to see Blue Beetle, because I know you want to.
First of all, yeah, Blue Beetle knocked my socks off, and I think it was because I wasn't expecting it. I saw a private screening because I had to do some reporting. I was speaking with the director and writer of the movie, so it was just me and my daughter Harper in a theater, probably about this size, just alone, watching the movie, and I was like crying uncontrollably during the film because I felt like it was such an accurate depiction of a Latino family and the layers of Latinidad in terms of this movie was directed by a Puerto Rican, Angel Manuel Soto. We as Puerto Ricans do not deal with immigration in the same way as the rest of Latin America. We can come to America whenever we want. It's a very weird deal that Puerto Rico is still trying to figure out if it's in their best interest. And then the movie was written by Gareth Alcocer, who was the only Mexican on staff. It's about a Mexican-American family. The writer of the movie was Mexican. It was just such a, first of all, it was a good, fun, goofy superhero movie. A lot of people say, oh, they're trying to be Marvel. It was like a fun throwback superhero movie tied into a beautiful story about being Latino in America that deals with things, microaggressive racism, gentrification. These are things that I deal with every time I step out my door.
Right.
So to see that represented in a genre that I love, that I normally don't see myself in to begin with, was very powerful.
Moment, yeah.
So I think we're going in the right direction. We've had 2 Black Panther movies. Blue Beetle has come out. I feel my DNA is satisfied in terms of of the last, what's been going on the last 5 years. Obviously, it was tragic that we lost Chadwick, and Wakanda Forever was more of a celebration of his life. But we really are moving forward. We've had superheroes, we've had Black superheroes, we've had Latino superheroes, we've had Brie Larson become Captain Marvel. And a lot of that movement started with the comic books.
And LGBTQ characters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a very healthy diversity in the world of comics because the thing about Hollywood has a lot of money. They don't have a lot of ideas. That's why there's so many sequels and remakes and things like that. So they're just going to pull out the library. So the fact that there have been movements, not to say it's perfect, nothing's perfect, but the fact that there have been movements to not only bring in new characters from diverse backgrounds, but to make sure that the people writing and drawing those characters are also from diverse backgrounds as well. I think it leads to a brighter and more inclusive future, because I don't think the superhero genre is going away. I don't believe in superhero fatigue. That's just something that Anne's not here, is she? I don't want her to, like, Anne's gonna be like, I said what I said and I mean it. No, I truly think that the superhero genre is just like comedy, just like romance, just like horror. It's not something that's going away. It's like something that's always going to be there. And I think it's not perfect. I didn't think Blue Beetle deserved to be dumped into August during a strike with, a third of the budget that most superhero movies gets, but, it's a little train that could. But progress is being made.
Progress is being made. That's exciting. That's a great note to end it on, progress being made.
We're not there yet,
David Betancourt, everyone. So now I think we're opening up to questions. The lovely Chantal has the microphone.
Hi, I'm Bruce.
Nice name. That's an important name in comics, if you don't know.
It's frequently the case that when you're looking at stuff that's been written over a long period of time, that writers at some point will think, I kind of screwed that up. Let me just change the history a little bit and fix the timeline that I did. How did you handle that when you're reporting on the first 100 issues? How did you find, things that they tried to fix? How did you handle those?
That's a great question, and we did have discussions because a lot of these, a good chunk of what I used for my research for this book were comic books written in the 60s. So there were times where I felt like I was reading Mad Men with superpowers in terms of, how the men acted, how the women acted, the things the women said. The Wasp, if you read a lot of the Wasp in Avengers comics in the 60s, she's like falling in love with every guy that walks in, and it's very, you can tell it's, quite frankly, written by a man in the 60s.
Different gaze.
Yeah, different days, different times. And thankfully, there's enough comic book gold in there in terms, because what the MCU is now is completely inspired by those first 100 issues. So there's enough good in there, and there's enough hope in there, and there's enough inspiration in there that it's enough of a supplement that, yeah, some of that dicey stuff is there, but I don't have to focus on it because there's enough good stuff here that we can build something good. Hope that's a good answer. Hi there.
What's your favorite Marvel character?
My favorite Marvel character is very unabashedly Miles Morales.
Just wondering, you probably are aware that so much of the superhero culture comes from Jewish Americans.
Absolutely.
Is there any reason why?
Brian is Jewish. Brian Michael Bendis, who co-created Miles Morales.
Why is the Jewish American so heavily involved in the superhero culture?
Well, as someone that is not Jewish, I don't know how much I can answer that, but I do know that, Simon & Schuster, who created Superman, they were Jewish as well, and, so much of early superhero culture was based on a lot of people who were going through an immigrant experience for the first time of being first-generation Americans or feeling like an alien. But it is, you cannot deny the influence that people like Simon & Schuster, Bendis, have had on the industry.
Yeah, by the way, I may be your harshest critic. I really look forward to reading the book because I own the first 100 issues of the Avengers.
Of course.
Of which everyone from 9 on up was bought off the rack.
Are they mint condition?
No, because I read them over and over and over again.
Okay.
I bought them back in those days, you bought them for fun. You didn't buy them for collector's value, but I'm very proud of that.
That's highly impressive.
Thank you. But part of that was my parents, even though we were poor, my parents would let me buy all the comics that I wanted, and I bought all the superhero comics.
They were affordable when I was a kid, and they were affordable when you were a kid.
And that's what my question really relates to, because of that, I was reading when I wasn't even 4 years old when I was reading, and I feel like that was important in my life story that I learned to read basically, and got a lot of my interests in science and history and mythology. Today, though, if you adjust the price of the comics I was buying for inflation, you're talking about $1 or $1.50, and now they're $4 or $5.
Comics are like $5 now. $5 a pop.
Exactly. That's what I mean. And they're concentrated at comic book stores and not at 7-Elevens or grocery stores or hardware stores, newsstands.
Because the specialty shops took over, and then that changed distribution.
So it worries me that my kids and other kids today don't have the opportunity to buy comics like you could when they were $1 or $1.50 in today's money. You could buy a whole lot more of them, and you could really get into comics in ways that seems to me it's tough for kids to do today. Does that bother you? Does that worry you about the future of
Is there an
comic
issue
books?
of access?
It does worry me, and that's a great question. As I mentioned earlier in our chat, if I could find $1 hanging around somewhere, I knew I could run the 7-Eleven and get a comic. I know when my dad was reading comics in the late 60s and early 70s, they were less than $1, 25 cents, 50 cents. I used to flip through my dad's old comics and watch through the price changes, 12 cents, 25, 50, 75. It was a long time before they got to $1. That is not the case now. It's a very, there is some big money in comics. I'm not getting it yet, but I hope to one day. But you've got some rock stars that are very expensive in terms of writers, in terms of illustrators, and that is part of what keeps increasing the price. I do think issues of accessibility, I think that is something to worry about. If I had a $20 bill, I could go to the comic store and get a lot of comic books. A kid with a $20 bill now can maybe get 3 comics. And it's just not the same thing, and you're right, it's accessibility, it's something the industry has to work on. It's why I think places like this are so important, public libraries. In our neighborhood in Mount Pleasant, the Mount Pleasant Library has a fantastic graphic novel collection, and it's a wonderful way to connect to these worlds and not have to worry about, do I have enough money? Do I have money for bags and boards? But yeah, it is something that, the prices keep going up. The quality is going up as well. There's some fantastic writers, some fantastic artists out there, but it is something the industry needs to look into. Great question.
Hi, David.
Hi.
It's so nice to see you in person for the first time since Superman's birthday party at the Library of Congress a few years ago
That's
that you
right.
moderated.
I did moderate. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I got to meet Paul Levitz. That was awesome.
Yeah, that was a great event. And
Thank you.
Speaking of the Library of Congress, I very much kind of watch closely the National Film Registry. For those who don't know, it's an ongoing list of America's most significant movies. They add 25 a year. They have to be at least 10 years old. I'm noticing that a lot of popular movies aren't making it on, and that's been a point of concern I've had. So
I'll get right on it.
right on. So my question is, I think the only superhero movies on right now are the original Chris Reeve Superman.
Iron Man's on there, right?
Iron Man made it on last year, and The Dark Knight made it on a couple years ago.
And those should all absolutely be there.
Yes, absolutely agree. What else do you think needs to be added of superhero movies in particular to the film registry? As if you couldn't tell from my shirt, I'm voting for Ninja Turtles, and I hope they make it on this year.
Ironically, I was just having a conversation about this with the gentleman sitting right behind you. My good buddy Neely Tucker, who used to be a reporter at the Washington Post, now works at the Library of Congress. Iron Man, I think, was a great start in terms of bringing the modern era of superhero cinema, which, truthfully, this era that we're in now started in 2000 with the first X-Men movie. But that first Iron Man movie is what sent it into hyperdrive. Iron Man absolutely deserves to be there. I think Endgame. And honestly, as I said to Neil the other day, I think Blue Beetle needs to be in there. I think the first well-told Latino superhero movie, for someone like me, and obviously I'm clearly biased in this situation, but has just as much impact as movies like Black Panther, Captain Marvel, Wonder Woman. I also think Wonder Woman should be in there. The first Wonder Woman should be in there. Yeah. But I'm very excited that movies like Iron Man are starting to, now obviously The Dark Knight was a special case. That was a movie that, Iron Man is like more so about the hardcore Marvel fandom. The Dark Knight kind of like, it didn't matter if you were in the comics, you were going to see The Dark Knight. Not every superhero movie can be that. Most of them rely on hardcore fandoms, people like myself who go and see it 4 or 5 times in a sitting. But I do think they're moving in the right direction with that. Iron Man is great. But the film has to be out, I believe, 10 years? So, you know, we've got some time, but I think between now and the next decade, especially what James Gunn is about to do at DC, don't sleep on, this is a guy that made 3 movies with a talking tree and a raccoon. And all of you know exactly who I'm talking about, Groot and Rocket Raccoon. So he's got the treasure chest at DC now, so I think he's going to be contributing to that in the near future as well. Yes?
First thing, big shout out to DC Public Library for their wonderful graphic novel collection.
Absolutely.
And even if they don't have it at Mount Pleasant, you know, go online, say, I want to request it. They'll send it to your closest library. My question, and you may have answered it earlier with the first 100 issues. Where's Wolverine
In the comics or?
in your book?
Yes. Well, first I will say, I do hope Wolverine's a character I get to play with. I love Logan. I love his backstory that was finally revealed. Origin is one of my favorite comics of all time that came out when I was a senior at Radford, and I think it's one of the best things Marvel's done over the last 20 years. He didn't make it here because we're so focused on the first decade that, not to say Wolverine doesn't have Avengership, which isn't a word, but they really wanted me to focus, because we decided it was going to be an origin story, the primary focus and mandate that I was given, focus on the original roster. I would have loved to have gotten, because that's the great thing about so many X-Men have been Avengers, and it's kind of like they have that dual citizenship, if you will, which is why, the Scarlet Witch and the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver are in an Avengers movie, and Quicksilver's also in an X-Men movie. But I was told to focus on the original roster, which meant it was kind of lock, set, key. But I'll definitely let DK know that you want me to write Wolverine. That would be great.
That's your next one.
What was your favorite comic of all time when you were a little kid?
Wow. When I was a kid, it was probably Amazing Spider-Man 317, which was written by David Michelini and drawn by Todd McFarlane. Todd McFarlane is a big rock star in the comics industry. He actually, if you ever go to Target and see like McFarlane figures, like that's Todd McFarlane. He's like a rock star in the comics world. But Todd was one of the original rock star artists at Marvel that went on to found Image Comics, but that's not what you asked. So Amazing Spider-Man 317, like Helena said, I have all this stuff in my head that just pops out sometimes. It was this issue where Spider-Man was fighting Venom. And I just loved the way Todd drew it. I loved how Venom was basically a meaner version of Spider-Man's black suit with the fangs and all that stuff. I was your age. How old are you?
I am 11.
I was your age when I was reading that comic. I was about 10, 11 years old. And the artwork just blew me away. And I was always, I'd open the comic and bring a pad and try and draw what I was seeing. But yeah, the whole comic is just Spider-Man and Venom beating the crap out of each other. And there's not even that much dialogue. There's this one scene where Eddie Brock goes to visit Aunt May to let Spider-Man know, I know who you are and I can hurt your family. And there's like all this tension, like Spider-Man's like almost like cursing, and he never does that. That's how angry he is. So yeah, when I think of favorite comics of my youth, I wore that one out. So yeah, great question.
David, I'm, hi there.
Hi, how are you?
Okay.
There you go.
Like you, I started out as a comic book geek, but I want to help answer his questions about why in the early comics it was so full of Jewish people. It wasn't only just Jews, it was also Italians when you look at the early comic book writers. But you got to think of comic books at that time were not considered proper literature. The Stan Lee story was Stan got into comics, and for years he didn't use his name Stanley Lieberman because one day he was going to write the great American novel, so he used Stan Lee for comics. So it wasn't really
right, he wanted to have his real name just in case the
yeah.
comics thing didn't work out.
So all of the guys that were able to get into the golden age of comics, because a lot of the early comic publishers were like, they were a little shisty, to say the least. A lot of guys, the guys that got into it were guys who were either Jewish, who couldn't get into writing.
They wouldn't have been welcome in the publishing
There
world.
you go. And Italians, because up until Joe DiMaggio, Italians were also considered second-class citizens.
Hey, my favorite artist, Jim Aparo.
There you go. So
Italian.
all right.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you.
She's coming around.
Hey, props on Blue Beetle, because I was going to ask him about that, but then you did, and I don't have to. Just want to make one correction. It was Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster
sorry.
who created Superman.
Who did I say?
And you said Simon and Schuster.
Sorry,
I think it's public.
sorry.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
Because I knew you knew.
See,
but I wanted to make
Jerry
sure they
Siegel, Jerry Siegel, Jerry Siegel,
You
and Joe
can't make a
Shuster.
mistake in this crowd. And you can't make a mistake with someone wearing that shirt.
Oh, look at that. Is that let me see if I can figure out who that is. That George Perez?
Show everyone this shirt, sir.
JLA Avengers.
Wow. So George Perez is one of the most legendary comic book artists of all time. He's also Puerto Rican and was one of the first Puerto Ricans to make it big in the industry, and actually wrote his appreciation when he passed away last year.
Yeah, okay, sorry. I got hung up here. So I was curious, because it doesn't sound like you had read a lot of older comic books.
No, I didn't.
Okay.
Other than fumbling through my dad and his cousin's old comics.
There's
but
some
no.
great stuff in there, young man.
Yeah.
But look, while I was flipping through this, I noticed some pictures, and I was curious because there have been a couple of attempts to sort of go back and kind of retell comics history, and I'm thinking specifically of, I think it was Earth's Mightiest Heroes, Casey and Scott Collins,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering to what degree something like that might have influenced you on this, if it did at all.
When it's funny because, not to say the rules changed a little bit once I started writing this book, but I thought I would have more wiggle room to add to the mythos. And Marvel, what they really wanted to do was pay homage to the mythos, but not create new stuff around it. I absolutely wanted to add new nuggets, which there are a few in there. I think one of the coolest moments for me, there's a moment in the book where I mentioned Captain America driving in Suitland, Maryland, past Andrews Air Force Base, because that's where my dad grew up. Because in the comic that inspired that chapter, he was, escorting a very high-ranking general, and I figured, well, if they're in the D.C. area, they've got to be somewhere near Andrews. So little things like that, little nuggets like that, I was able to make attempts to add my personality, add a little nuggets. But this was not an easy book to write. I actually had an editor reach out to me and say, it's a heck of an accomplishment, because the parameters were as such that once I said, okay, I want to use these 25 Avengers comics to base the book on, then I very heavily had to focus on those specific comics. Do I hope it's a little different in the future? Absolutely. Do I plan on making it different in the future? I hope so. But those parameters were already in place to be more of someone that's respecting what was already there instead of adding something new.
And as a journalist, I had to ask the question, so what was the copy editing like? That had to be horrid. We hate being edited in general.
We
I
do.
think that had to be brutal.
I actually had a fantastic editor.
Is he in the crowd?
No, he's
Okay.
Well, we do have Hank is here. He's a
Yes.
fantastic editor in the style, but he didn't edit my book. It was a British gentleman in his 60s named Alistair Dougal. So Alistair and I were on a big time difference, so we'd always meet. I usually meet with him early in the morning before I started my work day because it was already afternoon across the pond. But the editing experience with Alistair was great, because I'm sending in copies like, boy, they're never going to ask me to do anything again. This isn't very good, and here's another chapter. And then by the time Alistair, he wouldn't even do much, but just like, you could tell he was a pro's pro in terms of editing books. It clearly wasn't his first rodeo. And I would get that chapter back, and I'd be like, man, I wrote a pretty good book here. Like, this is pretty cool. But it was when it would go to Marvel, because there was a two-step process. Alistair would edit it for DK, and then Marvel Entertainment had to take a look and say, are we okay with everything here? And those were taxing, because when I say they want you to be very specific to what the book says, I'm talking like, well, you have Henry Pym's lab coat as purple, but in the comic it was white. And, Captain America did a jab, cross, uppercut, not a jab, jab, cross here. And so it was very...
I could see it being tough.
Very, Marvel does not play around when you're using their old work to inspire. So it was, it was also my first book. So, but Alistair was the perfect bridge to the calamity that was Marvel saying, let's tweak this, that, and that. So I remember the first 10 chapters, I was like, Alistair, I don't know, are we going to finish this book? What's going on here? But once we got into a rhythm and knew what Marvel wanted, it was cake the rest of the way.
Yeah. Awesome.
Hi.
Do you think that the Marvel movies depicted the comics well?
Great question. I do. The thing I like about Kevin Feige, who's the president of Marvel Studios and basically the head architect in charge of everything in the MCU, is everything cool about those movies comes from the comics. As someone whose job it is to write about superhero cinema, there was a brief period where Hollywood kept getting it wrong and getting it wrong a lot, whether it be Sylvester Stallone's Judge Dredd, or Tank Girl, or, I don't want to put Nicolas Cage in there. I like Nicolas Cage. But yes, Marvel, I think, has done a fantastic job of, they find this great balance of basing the movies off the comics, but not being completely dependent on them, because if you make a movie that's only based on the comic, people like me are going to know everything that's going to happen beforehand. They do a great job of mixing the history of the comics and the lore. For example, making sure in the first Avengers movie that they're fighting against Loki. Because why? Because in the very first Avengers comic, who are they fighting against? Loki. So they do a great job of paying homage to the past, but they also do a great job of making new things so people like me have reason to get excited instead of just saying, oh, I know everything that's going to happen. I think they do good work. Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. Hi, David.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Funke, and like you, I grew up loving comics from my brother and our parents who paid for the comics.
Mm-hmm.
And
Gotta have a financer.
And I could never believe, I'm in my mid-50s, I never imagined, that the comics we read back then would be,
The force they are now.
It's just unbelievable. And there are a lot of people like me. You can tell from my accent, I'm from Africa, Nigeria to be specific.
Motherland.
And, oh yeah, and my question is, there's a lot of fan base that you have in Africa, and I just wanted to know, Wakanda, you can tell from my t-shirt, let me show you.
The Black Panther, yeah, very nice. Wakanda forever.
So you have a huge fan base in Africa, and I just wanted to know if you were going to, turn this into like a roadshow. We have 1 billion people who love the Marvel, the DC world, the Marvel world, the Avengers, and if there's any plan, to get this on the road at some point in time.
Africa does have a very big comic book fan base. I actually did a story on, I don't know if you know this guy, his name's Roy Akupe. He's Nigerian, and he created EXO, a Nigerian superhero, and built an entire superhero universe around it, modeled after the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but in comic book form. And those comics became so popular that they were bought by Dark Horse Comics and are now published through them. I think there's unlimited potential in Africa, specifically because one thing I talked about with Roy, Africa in Hollywood is always depicted from a gaze that's not African. And what the new surge in African comics and African creators and African fan bases gives the potential to do, almost in a sense, not to bring up Blue Beetle again, but you can tell when the story is for you and by you, and I think there's great potential in Africa to expand upon that because, as you said, I'm fully aware, especially after doing that story with Roy, the fan bases are big out there. Africa's a large continent, and there's unlimited potential. Nice question.
Are you coming on the road?
Am I coming on the road?
Are you going to Nigeria?
I would love an all-expense-paid trip to the motherland. Let me. If you know someone that wants to fly me to Africa, we can talk afterwards.
My brother had this. He was talking about having the first 100 copies. So did my brother in Nigeria. But the thing is, back then, like you said, it wasn't for collection. We had this huge, cartons and boxes of comics because they would arrive, hot off the press.
Yep.
Within a week, they were, in our homes, in the stores, and we would get them. we never ever imagined. I'm horrified to inform everyone that we threw those boxes away.
You're not the first.
When you now hear of all this, first edition, mint condition, unopened, selling for, this incredible songs, you're like.
And there's a grading too, CDG grading.
Yeah, and you're like,
yeah.
I have it. And my brother went on actually to become an artist because of love of comics. So, kudos to you. I'm really excited about your book, and I'm really, really happy, to be here, seeing you, witnessing the amazing thing that you're doing, and you will, continue to do for not just, people of color, but people who love comics and who live in that fantasy world like I do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pressure for the last question. Mr. Betancourt, this is kind of a hot seat question. 3 quick responses to, during the course of your research, things that you found amazing, incredible, or shocking.
When I was researching the book?
That's a good. I should ask that question. That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. Wow. Let's see. 3 things. Tony Stark is always going to be Tony Stark. No matter the decade, that guy has a je ne sais quoi, the billionaire, the playboy, the not taking anything seriously. I thought I would go into it, because most of the comics I read were from the 80s and 90s, 2000s. I never read the Iron Man from the 60s, but to see how you could take the Iron Man from the 60s and throw him right into 2023, like, character ahead of his time. I was surprised how much I liked Ant-Man / Giant Man, who was Henry Pym in this version, and not Scott Lang. I did not start reading Ant-Man comics until the movie came out. I didn't really start reading Avengers comics until the first Avengers movie came out. I was big in the X-Men. I was big in the Justice League International. It was funny. I was like, wow, Marvel wants me to write a book. I'm like, I hope it's not an Avengers book. I'm like, I've read everything but Avengers. So I was, I went in thinking there were certain characters that wouldn't move me that much, but I was surprised how much I enjoyed. Henry Pym is such a tragic character. He's got this incredible woman that loves him, and he can't even see her because he's so focused on trying to be the next Tony Stark, trying to be the next great scientist. So that's 2 things. And the third thing was, it was a real thrill to get my hands on Miles Morales again. Because we were focusing on the original team and an origin story, I did not think I would be able to focus on a future iteration of the team in the present day. So when Marvel decided they wanted to get some of the more modern characters like Kamala Khan and Nova and Miles in there, it meant a lot to me to be, anytime I can get my hand on Miles, it's very special to me. So it meant a lot that I was able to get him in the last chapter of the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really quick before we go, I want to give a shout out to my wife, Gila Lopez. Gila, wave your hand. Gila always says we wrote the book together. I did not take book leave for this book, so it was a lot of nights and weekends and early mornings, and a lot of Gila saying, David, despiértate, hay que escribir ya, which means in Spanish, wake up, you got to write, There are a lot of times where, all right, I'm going to take a nap for an hour. At 11:37, wake me up so I can write for 2 hours. And she would do it. So, gracias, mi amor.
All right, David, I think are you signing?
I am.
You are signing. Okay, where are you
I think the table is right outside.
headed to? Okay, so David is headed outside to chat. Everyone who has their book, please meet him there.